Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion. My name is Edith, and back behind the microphone is the chattering teacup.
Hello.
Are you good, teacup?
Yes.
No tea in your cup?
Sadly not.
Sadly not, but maybe soon. Yes. And here with us, a regular guest on this show, Kimberly Sullivan. Hello, Kimberly, and welcome back on the show.
Hello, Edith. Thank you, Teacup, for having me. And what a nice thing to hear that I'm a regular. That makes me feel special.
Oh, yes, you are. You are indeed. And it's a pleasure to have you back, and also a pleasure to talk about your latest book, which came out in December 2023.
Correct?
Yeah. Rome's Last Noble Palace. It takes place on 3 timelines. And the question is, what can you tell our listeners about your latest book?
Yes. Well, yes, it does actually take place in 3 timelines, but one is in the modern timeline. So I do still call it a dual timeline, but you're absolutely correct, Edith. And yes, it's the story of Rome's last noble palace is a real palace. It's the Palazzo Brancaccio, which is here in Italy, and was built in 1896, built by a famous architect at the time in Italy. And yes, they did think there would be more palaces like this. However, of course, times were changing, not just in Italy, but in all of Europe. And these great noble palaces were not so in vogue post-World War I. So this was a different lifestyle. Things were changing a lot in Italy. But my timeline with the 2 stories is tied together by an attic room in the palace. So we have the modern timeline when the palace was, which is true, it was a wonderful museum of Near Eastern and Eastern art. And it was during this time that I wanted to have a story about Persian art, about an art curator who's a young woman who has a chance to live in the Palazzo Brancaccio. So a young American woman who comes over and has the chance to start her career there while she's doing her PhD. And she starts noticing kind of odd things, let's say odd sounds and everything that are happening in the hallways as she's living alone in this attic. And you find out slowly what the story is about one of the previous residents, let's say, of the attic room, who is Isabel, also a young American who came over. And this part is true about the museum, about the palazzo. It was built by an American princess, because people know a little bit about the so-called dollar brides that came over a lot to England and Ireland, a little bit in France. But they also came to Italy as well, some. And so they brought their wealth and married into very old noble families, but impoverished in Italy, and brought new wealth into that. And so it was this American princess who actually built this palace. And the character that I have, who is all obviously fictional, was the niece of this American woman, and her family wanted to send her over here to marry well, and she has other ideas. So, yeah, throughout the story, you kind of learn a little bit about the 2 women, about the 2 stories, a lot of similarities, even though one is in 1896, one is in modern days. Lots of things have obviously changed, but there are a lot of similar desires, traumas, dreams stopped by other people, people wanting you to do something, you wanting it inside, but having to always, have things about the time that might not have been exactly as you would like them to be. So, yeah, I had a lot of fun with these dual timelines and bringing these 2 women, these parallel lives, somewhat together.
Go on, Teacup.
As it's often quite difficult for authors to keep the story correct with one timeline. How difficult is it with 2 or even 3 timelines?
Yeah, I should explain with the 3 timelines, just for obviously you read it, but for the people who haven't read it. Sophie, I have 2 main characters. So Sophie is our modern character, and Isabel is the character in 1896. So when we meet Sophie, it is closer to modern. It's 2018. And she's coming back years later after having interned there. And we know that there's something that is disturbing her about the Palazzo Brancaccio, but we don't know what it is. And so the second timeline is going back in time to when she was a young, rather insecure intern when she was starting off there. So the timeline is always with Sophie's timeline, of course, in modern days. 1896, of course, I had to look at a lot of the things. I love Rome in general. You know, I live here for many years. And I do find the time to be fascinating because everyone thinks of Rome, of course, it is a very ancient city. But when we think about all the changes that were happening in Rome at that time, because as I mentioned in the historical notes, I mean, and as you know very well, but maybe not all of our listeners know, I mean, Rome was, I mean, it still is the head of the Catholic Church, right? The Vatican. But it was the papal states. It was separate from the rest of Italy. Even when Italy unified in 1861, Rome and large portion, let's say, of the state of Lazio stayed as the papal state. So it was separate from the rest of Europe, from the rest of Italy. And so until 1870, when they also conquered, let's say, Rome, the papal states, and Rome then became the capital, it was a very small, I don't want to say village, very, very small city, you know, for that. So it was growing. People were coming to Rome. It became the capital. So the 1890s was really a fascinating time in Rome. And so, you know, a lot was being built. There were a lot of urban projects. Termini rail station started. So I explain a little bit of that in there. There was a lot of cafe society, art and culture that wouldn't have been there to the same extent during the papal years in the same way. Of course, artists always came to Rome, but the cafe society and theater and everything was much more active in those years. So it was fun for me to look at this, how Rome was changing, and to have a character who would be kind of in the middle of it.
And we said so before we started recording, I got the impression there is a little bit of longing for Vienna in the book.
Well, I'm biased, of course. I love Vienna, as you both know very well. But one of my characters is, of course, an opera singer.
Yeah.
And what am I going to do? Of course, the character has to go to Vienna. I mean,
of course,
Italy and Vienna are the two really great opera capitals. So,
and also the mention of the cafe, this more or less role model of Vienna's cafe or Kaffeehauskultur, coffee house culture, is mentioned in the book as well. And although Italy and Austria are not always so eye to eye politically, culturally, it was a different cup of tea, speaking of teacups.
Well, yeah, the cafe culture in general, as you know, is different in, well, that's not true. That's, you know, it's very different in northern Italy and southern Italy. But the Caffè Greco, which is an important element in my story, that the women are going there often, I find fascinating. That's Italy's second oldest cafe, Caffè Florian, which is in a beautiful spot right on the, you know, in the center of Venice, and is really worth a visit as well, is the oldest in Italy. But Caffè Greco is the oldest in Rome. And it was such a meeting point for artists, people traveling on the grand tour, young writers and people who would go there and spend the days there. I mean, similarly to, as you know, with Vienna, that people would spend, you know, also you didn't have heating necessarily in your home, right? And you would go someplace to be there for the day. This was a large portion of the, you know, of the culture of the draw, and people would have their mail delivered to the cafe a lot of times. So there's a bit of a, also, I always like exploring class differences. And so Isabel, of course, she's from let's say a comfortable family that's lost a bit of money, but she's not obviously, she's put into a noble family and they have expectations for her. But she's not noble herself. She doesn't have any aspirations to be. And so she's very drawn to this culture of artists and writers and more of the eclectic group that is at the Caffè Greco. But that is something that was happening more, let's say, in the 1890s, a lot of different social classes mixing. And she always has these difficulties with her noble aunt, or she wasn't born into nobility, but becomes nobility aunt, who does not want her mixing with this type of crowd. So there was also a lot more of the urban dynamics that happened at the time, that a lot of social classes were mixing at that time in the 1890s. I mean, also, I speak in the book a lot about Piazza Vittorio, that they're very close to. That was a new urban center where people would go listen to music, take a stroll around, and all of the classes would once again mix. You know, you didn't necessarily have that to the same extent in many other periods in Rome, when it would have been very, very different between the classes. I mean, between the noble family.
Yeah, I mean, the past timeline, you mentioned it, takes place in 1896. I mean, it's the end of the century. There's a lot of change happening. You, for example, mentioned this new fashion of cycling, Which brings me back to another book I read. Do you remember the book by Linda Stratman where she mentions the cycling clubs where also women could take part? I mean, her cycling club was invented, but it could have been there. So it was becoming a new kind of sports for women, and it required different way of dressing as well. And Isabel's aunt is a bit put out by this kind of fashion. Shall we put it that way?
But is it because she wasn't born into nobility that she's trying to be more noble than the nobility of birth?
Yeah, that's a good point. It could be, but at the time, because she is a real character of history, and of course, with that, I feel a little bit bad because I'm inventing. I do feel a little bit bad for that because, of course, the snobbishness in this. The things that are real, the palazzo, the palace is real. She did actually buy a castle in this town outside of Rome, which is also, I have this in the book. She bought a medieval castle, which I find fascinating in the late 1800s to buy a medieval castle. She restored it. She became a patron to that little town. It's fascinating because you can go there today. But I think that especially if you look at the time in American history, these were the children of the robber barons. I mean, her father made great wealth from steel. So they were very wealthy. And in New York, yes, we didn't have the nobility, but you certainly had a huge difference. I don't know. I honestly don't know if it might have even been a little bit more than in Europe, because when you see how the robber barons lived compared to in Europe, where a lot of the nobility at that time maybe had waning financial resources, the American wealthy lived very well at the time. And so she also grew up with great wealth.
Do you also think just maybe, I'm not sure, you said correctly so, that in Europe, lots of nobility has lost a lot of money and keeping up appearances is always expensive, especially if you have a big household. And maybe also the fact that have been able to live the art of the understatement, maybe more if you're old nobility, more so than if you have come into money only rather recently.
Yes, 100%. Well, they were especially the robber barons. That era in the Gilded Age in America was very ostentatious, absolutely, and there is probably something to be said for that. That they really like to flaunt wealth, and so when the American tourists of that, of the Gilded Age of that period, when they came over, yes, I think that they spent incredibly. I think this because I speak about a little bit in the book too. But I mean, Worth gowns in Paris, of course, which was the height of luxury. You would come over and you would get, basically entire. You'd ship back so many of these. They'd come over for their fittings in Paris to get their clothing, and they would come back. So yes, there were a lot of the wealthy industrialists, and yes, it was very important because we didn't have this older, okay, so in New York, if you came from the bloodlines of let's say the Dutch and the English families, there would be a pecking order that they created in New York as well. The newer immigrants wouldn't be in the same, the same level. But there was always this kind of pecking order. Then they got replaced by the robber barons. And, they were a lot of times immigrants that came and made a lot of money. So it is very interesting. But yes, there was an incredible amount of wealth among a small group of people. And they would probably be considered to be very ostentatious and vulgar, I would imagine, by many of the older lines.
And also the fact you also mentioned it in your book, and I think it's still true to some extent, that the Americans, although they do not have a class system, Tika, we spoke about it.
They at least say they don't have a class system, a classless society.
But they are still very class conscious.
And very interested in the class system that exists in some countries like Britain in Europe.
Yeah, and that is actually why so many, this idea of the dollar brides, this is why so many wealthy families came over, and they wanted, because especially, I'm using New York as an example, because New York is the typical Knickerbocker. If you came from the old Dutch families or some of the English families, and you had a long, bloodline, long bloodline in America, it's not so long. Of course, you were considered to be the top. So I'm speaking about, the Astor Ballroom, to be invited to the Astor Ballroom. And so then you had, kind of these upstarts who made tremendous amount of money and wound up having much more money than these older families did, but they did not have the same respect.
Yeah.
And one of the ways to be able to outmaneuver this was to have a beautiful daughter who had millions and that you could marry into a wealthy family because, again, if they came back with a title, they couldn't overlook that. And this happened with a lot of the robber baron families that did this and married into, they would have a very lovely daughter with lots of money who would infuse new wealth into these families. And they would be able to come back. And even the old Knickerbocker families could not look the other way with that.
Yeah.
So, it is actually quite interesting. I mean, this time in America was absolutely fascinating.
Yeah,
So.
but then you have Isabel, who is supposed to follow that line of thinking. And yet, like you said, she's more interested in the arts, in the lifestyle of the artists, and she takes drawing classes and isn't it scandalous?
Yeah, but I think she can afford to have her own will.
Yeah, to some extent.
Yeah.
To some extent. And there is also another thread in your book which I found interesting because one of her friends, or someone who becomes a friend in when she's in Rome, her cousin is working as a nurse in a hospital, and she gets also interested in the patients and what is going on in this hospital. And shouldn't we talk more about that? And shouldn't it be more known that it's not a shame to have the so-called French disease? Especially for women, because they are always the victims. Although they get blamed, they are the sinners,
Sure.
although they are the victim of violence sometimes, or rather often.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that was also, I was fascinated with that, looking at old newspapers from the 1890s, because I actually put that, I was interested in that storyline because I just saw so many advertisements in the Italian newspapers for private appointments for basically mercury tablets, which is what they would have given, and they thought was a cure for the French disease, of course, being syphilis. So, which it was given the name the French disease because apparently the French soldiers with the Bourbon, right, that they were in Naples and it spread throughout Naples. Of course, they blamed it on the French, but someone had to be spreading it too. In any case, it sounds much more romantic that way. Interesting name, but yes. So of course, that's one of the aspects. But I'm not shocked that in 1896 these wouldn't really be thought of. But of course, there are a lot of different thinking at the time, and this is always the case, right? Younger people having different views from their elders, and it's not even necessarily Isabel's aunt who's really the big problem. It's her mother who wants her to marry well. So she expects it of her, and she has to go against her family, which isn't so easy. She's, the idea of disappointing her mother is one of the difficult things. And at that time, especially, she has other desires. She would like to have a life on her own, but there are societal expectations which are always strong, but a lot stronger at the time.
Yeah, but is it easier for an outsider to speak about the problems within a society than for the people that are stuck in it?
It's a good question. Although I think that at least with my character, with Isabel, she doesn't think that it would be easier for her in New York. I mean, she sees that her mother, the idea for her is that if she marries well, the same way that is happening there with nobility, she will bring a lot of importance back to the family since they have lost some of their money. But if she were in New York, her mother would still be striving in 1896 for an important marriage. So it would be pretty much the same type of thing. And she does in some way have more independence living abroad, far away from her mother. So there was absolutely a societal push at the time as well. I mean, women had to marry well, especially in that class. Obviously, they had to maintain at least the appearance of the wealth that she kind of grew up with, and then didn't have as much. So that's why it's so important.
And you also mentioned quite a lot the lower classes, maids, for example. They play a major role in the book as well. And I always found it fascinating to see how their lives were. I mean, I looked it up when I researched for Fractures and Hinges, and the girls were as young as 12 when they went into service. for example, in Vienna, they usually came from other parts of the empire, and they came to Vienna to work as maids. And if something happened, if they were thrown out by the employer without some sort of character credentials, where did they end up? They ended up in prostitution.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
a huge percentage of prostitutes at the time came originally from service. I suppose it can be also said for Italy or Rome at the time. Wouldn't have been so different. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, obviously not the same aspect that you had of the empire coming from different countries and coming there, but yes, a lot of them would have come as well from, around Rome. It's a lot of countryside and everything. So I do have some of the characters coming from I mean, Rome was much smaller. We talk about the Campagna Romana, the countryside, and the farms were just outside of Rome, basically. But yes, there are some of the characters, and Isabel is in an odd situation because she's not really. She's of course, with Auntie Elizabeth, she's in society a lot. She's at their dinners, she's at their events. She's a young, attractive woman, so it's they have her there. But she's not really part of the family, so she is a little bit closer to the servant class. So that's why she does have friends, but that wouldn't be so normal, let's say, among the nobility to befriend the younger women who are there.
But she finds out a little bit about these women when she visits the hospital. And she gets her eye opened a little bit, not just about her own situation, which we won't talk about because we won't give too much away, but let's say in general, because what Anna, the woman she talks to, tells her can be also said for other women at the hospital or other women in the city who earn their money by prostitution.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. But people in service obviously would be in a difficult situation as well, because they wouldn't, as you were pointing out, I mean, not being able to have references, being sent away for the family. This wasn't unusual, unfortunately, that people could take advantage of situations. So,
but as you are writing two different timelines in your book, in the situation you have the possibility to explore similar situations in different times and how people dealt with it.
Yeah, well, I love this idea. I mean, in general, I love history, and I do love continuity. Let's say in history, things change a lot, but a lot of the human emotions, human desires, situations don't. So I think it's nice to be able to look back in time and see that it isn't. Yes, we look at the old pictures and we see the old outfits and we love to look at them, but I mean, it's nice to explore the aspects that are similar. And I think that both of my characters are striving for something that they really want, and their desires, and they're, sometimes stopped at certain points, or things happen to them that are beyond their control, and they both have to work hard to strive to get what they want, or to live as they want to live, however that means for them.
Especially if you're a woman, not only in 1896 but also in 2006.
Absolutely.
And nothing changed. I mean, we like to believe that things have changed a lot, but like you said before, Teacup, when we spoke about it, it turns out again and again that not so much has changed at all. Are we deluding ourselves sometimes?
Well, things with certain people, say that I don't know. Some people, I like to have a mix of things. I think that my story is very hopeful. I think that I always have that, but I think that some people get very happy if you don't have a fully happy end. And so I'm not always making a happy ending and things like that. However, I think that both of my characters are very true to themselves. And so I think that they find a way to cope with trauma, to cope with difficult situations that is true to their own character. And also, we haven't spoken that much about Sophie, but with Sophie, when she comes over, this is a huge opportunity for her. She's very young, naive, insecure about her ability to perform, because it is a big responsibility to come over. She knows a lot about Persian art, but having to curate a big, important exhibition in a language that she's working in English, but she has to deal a lot in Italian, and she doesn't speak it well enough to be able to really do that. So she has a lot of insecurities as to whether she can do it, and she's perhaps a little bit too, leans on other people to do that, and she's perhaps a little bit naive with this. However, we see her years later, and as despite having gone through a lot of trauma, she does grow a lot as a character, and working towards, really achieving what she wants to achieve. So I hope that people feel that there's a sense of closure too with the characters, and that they, even if not everything is a happy ending, at least it's a sense of, of closure, of these two lives connected in some way, and of a little bit of understanding.
It does feel like closure. I mean, although not everything is a happy ending, not all roses, because it doesn't have to be, but it still is a positive outlook.
And if someone has to face huge problems, it gives them a chance to grow more than if there weren't any problems, because then you need to grow.
Yeah. I mean, that's something I spoke to my latest guest, Jeffrey Gardner, because his character wants to get rid of some of his memories. And it's fantasy, it is possible, but one of the other characters, a soldier, tells him, I wouldn't do that because everything I've experienced makes me the person I am today. Yeah. So, although I do see where the one character comes from, Thorn, what he experienced, I see his point. But on the other hand, would he still be the same if he got rid of those memories?
I don't think so.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I don't know the story, but I do. That does make a lot of sense for having this. And in fact, when the story opens in Sophie's perspective, we see that this fear is still living in her of her experience.
Yeah.
It's taken her 11 years to get back to Rome. Yeah. And she only comes because she's invited to the Palazzo Brancaccio to speak. And so she comes back, but she's very fearful. It's been there the whole time. She thinks that it's been long enough to be able to face her fears and come back. But being here, being back in Rome, seeing it again, is something that she's wanted to forget. So that is something that, yes, she did grow stronger. She did move on from things there. But then there's a moment of, do you hide away from it or do you confront it? And so that's a little bit of the timeline, which, as you know, we start off in the present day and then go back to understand, what she's facing.
Because the memories or the person, let's say the situation, the person who have caused those memories haven't conquered her. They didn't win in the end. If he didn't come back, the person would have won.
And otherwise, she might still be naive and insecure.
Yeah, no, I think she is very young, though. I mean, to be fair, I mean, she when she comes there, she's a PhD student, and she doesn't have this, and she hasn't traveled a lot. She hasn't had this world experience, so she is going into a very difficult situation. But at the same point, yes, obviously, as unpleasant as any hardship is, it kind of forces you into this, and that is her situation. That but for both women, I think that Isabel obviously is not as insecure. She does have a little bit more of she knows her place, at least in life, even if she's not as happy with what she's supposed to do. She's definitely more confident, but yes, the trauma shatters her as well, and changes the course that she would like to take.
Yeah, especially at that time. And again, we can't give too much away, dear listeners, because you have to read the book to find out what it is that causes Isabel to feel as if life hasn't dealt her anything to cope with it. Let's just say cope with it. She feels she can't cope with it. And why she can't cope with it? Read it for yourself. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating read, indeed. What about, you mentioned you have again and again, you're fascinated by history and especially this palazzo. And how much research did you have to do for this book, especially?
Yeah, because it's a little bit of a mix, obviously, of true historic facts and true buildings and everything. And then obviously characters that I made up and storylines that I made up. But yes, the Palazzo Brancaccio itself is actually very interesting, and a lot of what I've said about it is true. It was built. I mean, there's in the back they have a huge garden. There is a coffee house, because this is one of the things that, while she likes, since we were speaking about the Caffè Greco, that she likes going to, her aunt doesn't understand why she would want to go out with the riffraff in in society when they have their own coffee house within their grounds, which I must say that I have I shouldn't say this perhaps, but the doors were open at the Palazzo Brancaccio garden once, and I did sneak in to take a look at this beautiful coffee house, which is because it's sadly not open to the public, but it is beautiful, absolutely wonderful. To have a palazzo with a cafe all of your own, I think is really quite impressive. So yes, a lot of that and a lot of the building and okay, obviously I've taken real characters and did that. There's a little bit of a relationship with the artist who did a lot of the paintings that I took liberties in having him have some of the information about Isabel that serves later on. So a lot of this is really true. As I said, the San Gregorio, this real town, which is where this castle exists. I did go out to visit that town and the castle, and it's a wonderful medieval town in a beautiful spot. And Isabel goes there with the family, but then she goes there after she's had some difficulties, and it allows her to also, as you were saying, with her interactions with a lot of the people themselves rather than just the nobility. I mean, she really interacts a lot with the town. She really feels very comfortable there. She enjoys her time with the villagers, and it's a much more peaceful time for her to be able to spend some time and to, let's say, to heal a little bit. So these are all true places, and Rome itself, of course, was an exciting time because I have a lot with the opera because there's a romantic interest with, as you already pointed out, with a very handsome Italian tenor. So who also travels a lot to different places for operas such as Vienna and others. So yes, there's music. She is also is interested in costume design and in hopefully having an atelier for wealthy women because she's interested in fashion. So she's involved with these things. So yeah, these were really, I went to some excellent exhibitions on costume design at the time and on changing women's fashion in Italy. And it was fascinating to just see it. There really was, when you look, I'm not an expert on fashion, but I enjoy looking at it. And just when you look at how women, it was so much more freeing. We were talking about the bicycles before, but when you look at what people used to walk around with these huge hoop skirts and with all of these, basically constructions, they were so constricted. When you look at the fashion of the late 1890s and then going into the new century, it's true that women did have more mobility. They could walk around more. It was more comfortable. And so she is also very interested in that. The bicycle suits that they had, which were scandalous, right? But a little bit between men's type of suits and clothes. And so it was interesting to see this, that women were getting more freedom, let's say, at the end of the 1890s.
Yeah, a new century is looming. And I think there also is the beginning of the so-called reform clothes, where women were not wearing corsets and so on. And like you said, yeah, exactly. And fashion was changing a lot. Absolutely. Were you ever tempted making this book more Gothic-like?
I was actually, but I don't, for me, having a supernatural element is a little bit different for me anyway. I've never had a ghostly element within the book. So it's funny because I see a lot of people who have looked at the book and like ghostly elements. So they tell me about that and the fact that they would have liked to have more of it in. It's unusual for me to do. It was the first time that I did it. So I liked it, but yes, I didn't have it as, let's say, as Gothic, but I do love Gothic novels. I think they're really fascinating.
Is that not something you would like to put your toe in? Yeah.
I wanted it to be an element. I wanted it to be a connection between the two women, but I didn't want it to take over other aspects of the story.
Yeah.
So when I've also read a lot of Gothic novels that I love, it's really the factor that's driving the entire story. Yeah. Whereas I think here it was just similarly to when I have a story that has, not that I haven't written we spoke about Dark Blue Waves, which also is an historical romance.
Yeah.
But a lot of times I have romance elements without being a romance book. And so this has, the elements that I thought helped to bring the story together and have a little bit of mystery, but I wouldn't, it's definitely not a Gothic tale. It has elements of that.
No, but are you yourself maybe tempted one day to write Gothic? Just asking. I'm just asking.
I don't have it in upcoming projects, but never say never. I mean, I really, I'm always interested in new things. So, but yes, I mean, I absolutely love reading other novelists who are very skilled in that. I'd probably have to do much more of a study to be able to feel confident in writing a purely goth.
And asking a very not so charming question, what would you say to someone who would say, "Oh, it's just chick lit"?
I don't know. I'm not really against chick lit. I don't know about the title. The title, I think that used to be chick lit. It was big really in the 90s, the beginning of 2000s, right? So I really think of it around, I don't know, Bridget Jones's Diary or something when it got really big. But, even when people look down upon it, I'm so, Bridget Jones's Diary was a really nice book, and it's a retelling of, Pride and Prejudice. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't have a problem, like even the title of women's fiction, because I consider what I write. I write dual timeline, I write historical, I write contemporary, I write short stories, but I consider it all to be women's fiction. And there are some people who say, oh, you shouldn't use women's fiction because, I don't know, it's not serious literature. It's not in my country, the great American novel or something. And I don't agree. I love women's fiction because it's really the interior journey of the woman, of the protagonist. And I like being able to see that. And quite frankly, I always come back to it. Women read much more than men. So I don't see what is something that is, I mean, I've had plenty of men who've read my novels and said that they liked it. And that always makes me happy. But I assume that most of my audience is women. So I don't have any problem. Yeah, I don't really have this kind of snobbiness that says it can only be classic literature in this case. I mean, I like women's fiction. Even chick lit would be different because it's a little bit of a funny angle, I think. I don't think this would anyway, not because I'm trying to distance myself from it, but I don't think that something like this would be considered to be chick lit because it's not quite light and humorous as much of it is. But sometimes I like to read a good chick lit novel. I think that they're funny. I think I like to break up my reading a lot anyway. I like to read a lot of historical and then I'd like to break it up. So no, I mean, personally, I'm not against it.
Yeah, it has its place. And like you said, women read a lot more than men do. Usually you do have your audience, and occasionally the one or two men, or more, of course, men can also enjoy the books. Like you said, it's romance. It's not really romance. You have a romantic element in the books, but it's not exclusively romance.
It's not a romance novel, as you imagine it.
Yeah.
But it's in there.
Yeah, it has a lot of different elements, which makes it interesting for a huge audience, actually, because like you said, you have the ghost element in this one, you have timelines, you have history in it. So it makes it available for more than just one sort of reader.
And you should always mix up.
I like mixing genres. I think it's fun to mix genres, and to have different things. Just personally, I like it. I like it as a reader, and it's fun for me as a writer. And I didn't actually, when I started writing this, I didn't know that I would have a ghostly element. I decided to, so I did not plan it as a Gothic. That is why I did when you asked me that. But I wanted a way to have some kind of connection between the two women, and so it served the story well. And so, as I was thinking about it, I liked this idea of her having a connection with the former resident. And I think this is just something, and maybe it's also an American being in Europe, but one of the things that I love so much about Europe, obviously, is all of the history. I mean, in America already, if something is 100 years old, it's considered so old in America. And I'm always embarrassed when, in New York, people say, oh, St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York is so old. And it would have been, built about the same time as my time story here, right, in the 1880s. So, that's not so old. Here, you just think about all the lives of the people who lived before you, all the people who are living in the same palaces that have been here for hundreds and hundreds of years. I love this idea of trying to look at that and these lives that, we don't know that much about the people who might have lived in the buildings where we're living hundreds of years ago. But I like the idea that maybe people kind of had the same dreams, the same ambitions, the same disappointments.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, emotions don't change. I mean, that's why we always say Shakespeare will never be out of favor, out of time, or old or dusty, because what makes people react or act and what motivates us, it was the same in Shakespeare's time as it is now.
And even before that.
Yeah.
I mean, there are more or less the same stories in the classics and probably even before that. Although we can't read them.
Yeah.
Because humans
Absolutely.
haven't changed that much.
No.
The framework definitely has changed, but what drives humans
it's still the
is still
same.
more or less the same.
Absolutely. Which is why in a city like this, you go around and you look at the artwork from ancient Rome. You look at at the Colosseum. There were kids who did little graffiti of their favorite gladiators. So they've discovered this. They have little carvings, which would be, I don't know, the equivalent of a boy who goes to see football today, right? And has his favorite football player. So, you see all of these things that are different lives 2,000 years ago. We look at the art, but it moves us today because,
And if you walk through these old buildings and think about the people who have or might have lived there and start thinking about them, there you have your ghosts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, especially if you look at a city like, here in Italy, right? Pompeii. Buried by the lava and then rediscovered. And that's fascinating when you go there because it's been so perfectly, exactly. And you also have the casts of, sadly, the people who are trying to escape. But, you see the villas, how they were. You see roads where they had the roadside, maybe the equivalent of what we would consider fast food, because that's where you would go and pick up something to eat and continue walking. And you can just see it so wonderfully preserved, but not changed by time, because obviously so much of the Italian cities, yes, they've incorporated parts of the past, but you have the things living side by side. But in Pompeii, you're just so struck by it because it's how life was 2,000 years ago. And you can see the city preserved this way.
I think it's fascinating because it gives us a view into everyday life, how it actually was. But on the other side, it's somehow eerie because it's so preserved.
Especially in Pompeii, in Herculaneum, absolutely. I mean, we also have our excavations from the Roman times here in Austria, of course.
Sure.
But nothing as good as preserved as it is in Pompeii.
It's like a picture somehow.
Yeah.
Because it's preserved as it was.
Yeah, exactly. Frozen in time.
Yeah.
In a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely frozen in time.
Lava.
Frozen in one day.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That is something, it's food for the imagination, I suppose, also.
Yeah, it's also scary.
It's scary.
If you think about it, what happened, how
Can you imagine being there at night? Can you imagine being there alone at night when we talk about the idea of that is a place that you would think, oh, this is has, the past. I'm not someone who generally believes in ghosts or things like that, but when you look at something like that, you could think, oh, this would be very eerie if you were all alone in the evening at a place like that.
I think it's the same, like I don't want to be at a cemetery during the night.
I have been, but yeah, you grew up with all those ghost stories and you think...
Exactly.
I've
never lived in an attic with these strange sounds, but if I have to say, if I were like Sophie, I would probably, even being someone who is not so drawn to that personally, I probably would change my mind and wonder maybe.
In this case, I absolutely agree. But coming back to the cemetery, you realize when you look at the newspapers, it's not the dead you have to be afraid of.
Yeah.
It's the living who are dangerous, more dangerous than the dead. Except for vampires, but we're not talking about vampires. But it's a different cup of tea. So
there are no vampires. No spoilers here. I don't want people to think there are vampires.
No. Of course, no vampires. Not in this book. No vampires. No werewolves. No vampires. No zombies. Nothing like that.
Unless
good, because I know that speaking about genre, that is a genre of people who really expect that, and I would hate for someone.
No. To make that clear, no.
Unless they're in disguise, we don't know about it.
Yeah, but not in her book. Not in her book. No. Kimberly, what can we look forward to from you?
Yes. Well, I'm now finalizing my actually, Edith, since you did ask me chick lit, I don't think it was chick lit, but my first novel was a modern retelling of Three Coins.
Mm-hmm.
And I did get reviews from people saying that they like chick lit. And that might have been my one that was closest, let's say, to chick. I don't think it is quite chick lit, but it's a little bit that way because it was a modern retelling of three American women who meet outside of Rome in Sperlonga, beautiful beach resort there, but off season when they're all facing their own problems and they become, kind of unlikely friends, and that helps them with their lives. So I decided I'd like to do a series. So this is 3 coins. It's 5 years later when they have. 2 of the women have left Rome and they're now living in Umbria. I don't know if you know the region of beautiful Umbria, which is very nice. And they are running an inn, an agriturismo there, which we got to know a little bit about in the first story. And I like that idea because, well, one, I like these women and I wanted to kind of continue with their lives and see things how it had developed. But one of them is running the inn, and another of the women really loved cooking, and she was not very happy being an English teacher, and she loved the idea of having the chance to go and cook and have cooking classes at this hotel. So we see them then, and they are running this hotel, and it gives me a nice opportunity to have different guests at everyone. So guests they come with their own, let's say, baggage, both physical and psychological. And, they're on holiday when often people have time to kind of reflect on their lives, make changes that they might want to have, or, as we know, travel can always change us as well. So, so I've just finished writing that. I'm editing. It will go out to my editor and beta readers, and I'll have that coming out later in the year. So the kind of the sequel to 3 Coins. And I'll have a few of them. I've decided I'd like to continue and have different series of guests coming in and kind of explore that. And the lovely thing is, as always, that's a much easier research when you do contemporary, because, with historical, I do spend a lot of time going back, looking at things. But contemporary, I had the very difficult task. It takes place in a town, Todi, and I've been there many times, but I hadn't been in a long time. So, of course, I had to go back, right? And rediscover it. And
how tragic.
Eat the food and walk the streets and do all of that. So, I mean,
hardship of the hardship.
As one of your main characters is a cook, did you also try to cook a lot?
Well, I do. No, I do not cook as well as my character, who just loves it and does it all the time. But yes, I do cook. And yes, of course, I know Italian food because I do it. But I'm definitely not going to put myself up alongside a professional, because she marries a professional chef and they work together. So I'm not ready to teach people cooking classes, but I do. Yeah, I do get by with cooking Italian food.
And the crime fiction fan in me also has to ask, will there be a murder in it?
I haven't got, I love reading those books, but I have not. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Never mind.
Planning a murder. I don't want to give anything away, but I'm not planning a murder at the end. They've just gotten off the ground. I mean, the problem is if I start having murders and galore, they're not going to have much success for the hotel, right?
So food poisoning wouldn't be
not a good
in the cards.
No, wouldn't be a good idea.
Our friend Carmen with cyanide, huh? No, I didn't plan on that, but perhaps at least I know where to go. I could ask her.
Exactly, and her second book is out as well, a sequel to her at Cyanide. You will enjoy it as well. Absolutely.
Well, we were just fellow winners. We were just fellow winners of the Indie Today Awards. So she got one for her novel, and I got one for Rome's Last Noble Palace and for my short story collection.
Congratulations.
So we were just commenting the other day.
And congratulations to Carmen as well, of course.
Exactly.
Yep. So, I mean, it would be easy for us to meet because she's in Belgrade, you are in Rome, we're in Vienna.
Exactly.
We should meet up. What are your plans for the summer?
That is a good question, because I have to go back to the US in May. No, because usually I go back in the summer, but this I'm going back in May. So I don't have set plans. So we should talk.
Yeah, definitely. Fully agree. Definitely. We really should. And Kimberly, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know?
Just to thank both of you for having me on here, because I always love coming on and discussing the books. And if your readers enjoy stories set in Rome, then of course I would be very happy if they would like to take a look at my website that has all of the information on that. So it's Kimberly Sullivan Author. bookcompanioncontact.com. And yes, if you're interested, please sign up for my newsletter. And I, every 2 months or so, send some information around. I always have book news. And because I'm a bit of a travelaholic, as I think you ladies are as well, I usually tend to include some information. There's some research related, or so I claim, others excuses for research. And I always have book reviews for authors, books whom I love that I include, because I do a lot of book reviews for other books that I read and other indie authors, other women's fiction authors. So I enjoy doing that as well. Oh, I can also say I'll put a little plug in, because I'm editing an anthology of historical fiction, which is called Feisty Deeds. It's about feisty women in history. And that's been so much fun, because I'm with the Women's Fictions Writers Association, one of the writing groups that I'm with. And I had just asked if people would like to do an anthology, because we're all writing in different periods, different genres. And it was so much fun. I'm working with another 4 women in WFWA, this organization. And we put out a call with the writers and said, would you like to contribute to this? And it's really fascinating, because every woman has interpreted feisty differently, depending on the time, the place, which is true. I mean, feisty can be, being involved on the edge of a battle. It can be an invasion and how you have to rise to it. It can also be, small acts of defiance within the family at a very rigid time. So it's really fascinating to see. And so I've been very busy, along with my colleagues. We were all doing writing and putting it together, editing those and getting them out. And those will also be out in 2024. So I have to say, I'm spending a lot of time editing other authors' writing. Fascinating. It's really, really a fun look at feisty women throughout history.
Sounds interesting.
From the 1400s up to 1960s.
Something for me as well.
And feisty women often are quite funny, I think.
Exactly. And since you spoke of feisty women, another little tidbit of Austrian history in your book: was Empress Elizabeth feisty?
Was she feisty? That is a good question. I do not know, because she certainly broke with tradition. She certainly had, views that would have been different from the time. I mean, obviously, also even the relationship with her mother. I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact, because Hungary probably much better than I do, but I've gone to Hungary quite a bit in my life. The idea that you learn Hungarian well enough to speak with your daughter, largely because your mother-in-law hated Hungary. I mean, Hungarian has 16 cases. I'm sorry, I learned Czech the 3 years I was there with 8 cases. But when you tell me 16, I'm like, no, I'm sorry. I already, for me, that sounds pretty feisty, personally, the fact that you... So I don't know. She also probably had some, how can I say this kindly? She must have had some problems, some other things. But I mean, certainly with the strictures of society, I guess that you could say that. She's certainly a fascinating woman.
Absolutely.
I love when I've been to I really found that interesting, the year that I lived in Vienna, going down to her grave, that you have there. Whenever I would there or take, visitors there and see it, that there's always fresh flowers from her with the Hungarian flag. I mean, it's so loved today it's just interesting to see, because it's not that I was personally visiting so much, but I would have friends that were coming by and we would go in to see that. And she's so loved today. And really this idea of spending so much time there, of again, learning the language well enough to speak to her daughter in Hungarian and make that, one of her primary languages when she didn't grow up speaking it, it shows some real character.
And rumor has it her influence wasn't so small in turning the Austrian Empire into Austro-Hungarian Empire. So
that is absolutely, because she obviously played an important part in that way, and the fact that, again, she's still so loved by young Hungarians today who still go there and show their admiration is, for me, was fascinating. Did you see that film of Empress Sissi?
The new one? No.
So because I go up quite often to Ancona now, I can't get it out of my mind, because of course it's a fictional show of her. It's beautifully shot. It's really interesting. But they have her committing suicide and a fake sissy. Yeah, it's all very weird, the end. But where she commits suicide is in Ancona. So now every time that I go to Ancona, because I go fairly frequently, I'm thinking of that scene of Sissi jumping from the ship in Ancona.
Oh God, whose idea was that one wonders?
It's a very odd ending, but there are beautiful scenes, beautifully shot, wonderful costumes.
I mean,
it is.
Why turn it into a suicide? I mean, her death was tragic enough. I mean, why make it so overly dramatic?
Yeah, I didn't get that either, because she didn't want to be. So they have her that she does not want to continue. So she has her lady's maid basically taking her, becoming her. Yeah, I know. I thought her life was so dramatic that you could have easily stuck with the original.
Yes,
but I agree. When it's handed to you, especially as a writer, when it's handed to you on a silver platter, as it kind of is in the life of Sissi, you would think, yeah, I'd go with that. I don't necessarily have to dramatize it, right?
No, absolutely not. I mean, she was a tormented soul in a way. She had her psychological problems, and she had to cope with the fact that her beauty was gone.
Yeah.
And
that is the most interesting fact of the movie. That itself makes the movie worth it, because it shows her in the later years and how she didn't want to be seen, and how her great beauty, and how it was always kind of thrown in her face. That and we know that she suffered from that a lot. So and probably had eating disorders and other psychological problems. But that is the most powerful part of the film that I thought was beautifully done. I didn't like the ending, but up until there, I thought it was a really beautiful exploration of a lot of these elements.
Anything else, Kimberly, you would like to share?
Thank you so much for having me, and I cannot wait until we meet in person in either Vienna, Belgrade, Rome, points in between.
That would
the empire doesn't stretch down to Rome, but parts of Italy in the north, it would be okay.
Would be lovely.
Stick.
Absolutely. We absolutely have to do that. And thank you for making time for us again.
Thank you so much. Had such a fun time.
You did enjoy this episode as much as we did? Then hit subscribe and don't miss the next episode. Also, make sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you like to support us and buy us a coffee, you can do so via Buy Me a Coffee and other platforms. You can find all the necessary links in the description. Until next time.